Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo and Cryptids encounter stories. First story. This story was shared by you/James Knightorian. Just had a mini revelation on a past childhood trauma. So, I'm going to start this off with some backstory. I was minding my own business alongside my parents in a nice home in northeast Alabama. I'm not sure exactly when this was, but I was around 7 in age. Anyways, we're sleeping peacefully, and suddenly we are all three awoken by this absolutely terrible growling sound, almost like that of a bear. This wasn't just a normal sound though, it sounded like it was on our front porch. My dad assumes that a black bear has decided to chill on our porch, and he grabs his shotgun, prepared to defend himself if necessary. He holds me and my mother up, and goes outside ready to confront this bear. To his surprise, no bear was outside. He assumes it ran off, and tells us we can just go to sleep again since all is fine. He assured us that bears can't unlock doors, like that helped any. Right before we begin falling asleep again, we hear a very distant giggling. This doesn't give off the vibe of a normal giggle though, it gives off that, oh hell no, tone that makes you just want to get out of Dodge. My mother whispers to my dad, what the hell was that, and my dad whispers over to me, was that you? I simply reply, no. Another few moments pass, and we hear a slight yelp, seemingly closer, but also quieter. We don't think anything of it. At least that's until we hear a woman scream distantly. This once again gets my dad and mother up and alert. My dad once again grabs his shotgun, but this time he doesn't go outside, he even seems scared now. Obviously this worries me. After about 30 seconds of us kinda just sitting around, another scream happens. But this time it's directly in our yard, about 10 yards away. My dad rushes to turn off the lights and simply whispers, don't say a word. I'm not sure what exactly happened after that, but nothing else seemingly happened that night. I'd assume I dozed off. I'm not sure why this only just now clicked with me, but I now realize this fits the description of a skinwalker really well. It's possible it might have all been a misunderstanding by my family, but I simply don't think that'd be the case considering my parents recall the same things. I have recently done a lot of research into skinwalkers, and I've rethought this past trauma of mine and made a connection. Sorry for this being drawn out, but I just randomly decided to post this before I forgot any important notes on the event, even though I doubt I'd likely ever forget any of this. TLDR, a past trauma of mine, hearing screaming in the woods along with other sounds, is explainable through the Skinwalker creepypasta/folktale. If anybody has any questions of the event, I'm sure I'd be able to answer them. I seriously want to know if there is a possible explanation of this that isn't paranormal, but not many are possible. Extra note. I'm sure somebody would ask this, so I'm gonna go ahead and answer it. I didn't have nightmares and stuff before the event, other than the usual child nightmare stuff, but I did have a few eerie nightmares directly following the event. One dream, I dreamed of being chased down a hallway by some creature. Not sure if it was human or what. Another dream I had, my entire family's voices had gone demonically deep, and they all kept saying, don't hide. And the last one I'll point out is a dream where my mother disappeared out of nowhere. Like thin air, out of the car. All of these I vividly remember and still creep me out to this day. Second story. This story was shared by you/subsetofapophenia. Multiple creatures or just one thing following me through my life. Hey everyone, I'm going to try keep this as short and readable as possible, but there are a lot of parts to this story. So apologies if it's super long but might be interesting to you. This is all as true can get. I needed to talk about it to people who get it, as the people I'm currently living with keep brushing it off. Firstly, I want to say that I do believe we create things with our thoughts, and I try my best to control those and keep fear held away from me. Second, I want to say that some of the parts of this are stories told from my grandmother and my father, both members of the Six Nations in northeastern Pennsylvania. They never had a name for this but told me these things without ever speaking to each other about them. They both spoke of it as a cautionary story, not something just to scare me. I've lived near the Jacks Mountain Ridge part of the Appalachians all my life, apart from a few years when I lived in the valley of the Allegheny Mountains. Both locations I've experienced things I can't really explain. My grandmother and my father, two separate families and different tribes, also have lived in the central PA area most of their lives as well. The first story was told to me by my dad on our picnic table in our backyard at night where I lived as a 5-year-old. This same house was the childhood home of my grandmother, who had given it to my mom, her daughter. My dad warned me to only go outside at night if he walked with me from the house, or if he was in the shed a few yards away from the house to take long steps but don't run, and go straight inside with him, not to screw around in the dark. That same year I was watching my favorite VHS in my bedroom, which at that point was previously a screened porch but now covered by sliding glass doors. Outside those doors we had many stray cats on a little ground level deck. Behind this house are woods for miles going up the mountain. That night my curtains were open so I could watch the new kittens that were just born run around and practice hunting bugs under the old light mounted on the outside wall. But the kittens and their parents had gone somewhere else during me watching my TV in between. A few moments after I noticed that they were gone, I heard a heavy weight creak all over the deck. Then I covered most of my face with my blanket when I saw a dark-colored or soaking wet cougar looking right into the glass doors at me, just watching me for a long time but not making a sound. It eventually left, but I had trouble sleeping that night and my parents wouldn't allow me to sleep in bed with them anymore. We had cougars in our area, but most of them stayed in the mountain where there was a surplus of deer, and my street had many houses where my extended family lived, and they'd all shoot guns and fireworks so big animals wouldn't frequent through, usually only a small bear wanting to eat my aunt's pear trees. The really scary part is, I spoke to my grandmother about that experience offhand a few years later. She sighed, stopped for a moment, and told me that the same happened to her as a child living in that house, but it was at their front door, which was just an old beaten screen door. She also described it as a black panther, which I don't think we have up here unless it migrated from the south. This must have been at least 40 years in between. She also revealed to me that her parents told her not to go out at night, no whistling even in the daytime, and don't go close to the farm animals that used to be there, 2 cows and a horse, at night. She said when she married her husband at 14, Christianity started coming into her life around that time, so tradish stories and values eventually were seen as demonic, especially those stories, so she put them at the back of her mind. The next part comes when I lived in 2 different places. In our next family home before my dad passed, we lived less than a mile from a wood mill tucked into the same mountain. The wood mill would start its loud noise at around 6 a.m., but some mornings I would wake up before that when I heard flute music coming from the mountain. This sounds corny, but it is definitely what I heard. My window was 2 stories up, so I felt safe opening it. The music sounded distant, but it was distinctly a song. This happened like 4 times. Sometimes I would also see a strange light in the mountain where there were no houses. I know the buildings of this area well, as my family has lived and still lives in buildings all over this mountain. About 5 years later I lived in the Allegheny Mountains outside of Pittsburgh. I lived with my boyfriend there temporarily, so every other weekend we would take the long drive back to the Jacks Mountain area to stay with our respective families. On our night drives back to Allegheny, when we would get about 10 miles from our house, we drove on a route of curvy back roads. One section of this road went into the woods where there was a small shoulder that people would drop off very old fat-back TVs for them to rot without having to pay a dump fee. Almost every time we drove past that part at night, there would be a wonky-looking deer standing among the TVs just staring at the car when we drove past. We had laughed about it and named him Tim and just thought he was an outcast deer who made friends with the abandoned TVs. But nowadays I question Tim the deer. So currently I'm staying with that same boyfriend and his parents, as our apartment had lots of safety issues that were not going to be fixed. His parents live on the opposite side of the mountain I lived as a kid. So this is all the same ridge and forests. First off, his parents have told us strange stories that they brush off as silly that have happened while they lived here alone, with all their kids moved out. One was about an escaped man being tracked by a light from a helicopter the same night someone banged on their door. Keep in mind this is another road owned by one family in a small neighborhood in the mountains valley. Another time they told us they saw a man standing by their collective mailboxes at the end of the road, wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase, who then walked up into the woods going up the mountain. My boyfriend told me before that when he and his brother were little they would play in the mountain. They had seen trees that were bent over halfway up, some ripped out by the roots and lying on the ground away from the original place of the tree. They would play games inside a huge and deep bowl-shaped crevice in the dirt that seemed like it was dug and dried out years before. My boyfriend used to smoke weed in secret in 7th grade out of his ground-level bedroom window. No screen in the window, so he could stick his head out and blow smoke out, but with the blinds pulled down while he played video games. He'd done it many times before, but one night he heard an incomprehensible deep voice talking in what he described as what English would sound like if you didn't speak English, right outside his window and shuffling in the garden beneath. He slammed his window shut, turned the lights off and hid until he fell asleep. A few months ago, when spring was turning into summer, he and I took our old dog out front to go to the bathroom around 9 p.m. We were right in front of the house, which is catty-cornered from his grandparents, all on a stone road surrounded by grass and trees. We suddenly heard what sounded like 50-plus people laughing hysterically, but also yelling, male and female, and dogs going nuts in the distance probably a mile away behind us. Us and the dog froze. My dog didn't bark, we just stood terrified. The sounds only lasted about 5 seconds and they all stopped at once at the very same second. Then 3 more seconds passed and we still couldn't move until we heard a phlegmy snarl coming from a bush about 20 feet in front of us. We were both in shock that we would hear 2 terrifying sounds we'd never heard before that seemed far away from each other happen so close together. We pulled the dog inside and ran with our stomachs ready to shoot out our asses. A few weeks later I was out in the daytime and heard what sounded like something doing a bad impression of different cat noises coming from the backyard. I didn't bother investigating and just wanted to forget the sound as it sounded unnatural and not like any bird I'd ever encountered. Cut to last night. I work evenings, so I stay up late on weeknights, sometimes until 2 or 3 a.m. Last night I went to take my dog out to pee at around 1:45 a.m. Earlier in the night I took him out at dusk and heard 2 men whistling getting in a truck down the road, and my mind went straight to what my grandma had said about whistling. When I took him out later that night in pitch black, I stand in the doorway with the leash in hand while he goes off the front porch into the yard. Fall is turning into winter now, so I try to stay inside. It's usually fine with just frogs and other night animals making noises. But last night my dog barely walked onto the porch and started barking to the right of the woods in front of the house. Something was coming towards us only about 30 feet away, parting the bushes, and I saw a big flash of cream color before I ripped him inside. I feel bad about pulling my dog, but I would rather him be pulled by me into safety than whatever the hell was coming at him. We've had a small bear come through here before, but he is very shy and runs from our dogs no matter how small they are, and is quickly chased off by a flashlight. Never has it ever come towards us, and it wasn't a cream color, just a simple black bear. I wish I had stood a little longer to see the shape of this thing, but my adrenaline kicked in and I had to get my dog and me back inside and locked the door quickly. Boyfriend's parents woke up because the door caused their dogs to bark. Also my dog continued barking when inside, which he doesn't do as he's a super meek and quiet 16-year-old dog. I was up shaking for like an hour after that, and my boyfriend's dad keeps writing it off as the bear, but I am insistent there is no way it was a bear. His dad still doesn't believe us about the sounds we heard previously and writes it off as a party going on. But what party have you heard where the people act like dogs, yell and laugh, and suddenly all cut off at the exact same time? Didn't think so. They don't even want to believe in the many ghost experiences we have all had in this house. We do have a Ring doorbell camera, but we switched Wi-Fi providers a few days ago, so it's not synced up to a phone right now until my BF gets home later to connect it, but it may still be recording. If I'm able to see last night's footage after we get it reconnected to a phone, I will post anything it caught. I know this is long and all over the place, but I was hoping someone could read and maybe help me make sense of all this. I couldn't figure out which subreddit to post in because I can't identify what the hell has been going on, so this seemed like the closest or possibly most helpful sub I could figure. This has all happened over the course of 25 years, not including the stories of people who lived before me. Do you think this is multiple creatures or one thing that can encapsulate all of these events? There are things that seem to mimic other things, and parts that sound like Bigfoot encounters, and just strange events by themselves that don't sound like either, especially the man in the suit. Thank you for reading and whatever responses you may have. It's nice to not feel alone with these stories anymore. Third story. This story was shared by you/BreakingPointDev. My wife saw me engulfed by an ethereal white misty orb of light. Here's what I believe. Some years ago my wife and I were ghost hunting at Fort Stevens in Oregon with our cameras out. The orbs were maybe a few feet in diameter. The first one appeared near me for a split second, then when I headed in that direction it appeared again, engulfing me. I think it was centered around my heart, since I was able to see a little more from my right eye out of its mist, like it was just below my head to the left. Immediately after that her camera for some reason had no recording. My camera was just broken, with the image and audio being very distorted attempting to open the camera app. Our phones went from nearly full batteries to nearly dead, and we were suddenly intensely fatigued the rest of the day, like we were working out for hours. It was a very peaceful sensation for that moment. It was overlapping me. What I believe now is that aliens and all the paranormal are just beings of various densities of consciousness that interact with our dimension as they please. Stephen Greer gave an amazing explanation of how alien ships go through mountains and objects with no interaction. Same applies to all the paranormal, I'd imagine. There's so much space between atoms that if all the billions of us were condensed it could be smaller than a sugar cube. So all these beings with their higher densities and control of their own consciousness are usually out of sync with all the atoms of our dimension, but are technically overlapping us all the time, and they can choose to align to our dimension just visually or physically if they want. Diving deeper into the consciousness thing, if you're curious, it's said that we're third density, physical, just touching on fourth density now, with fourth and fifth densities having to do with holographic physics like quantum theory suggests, and then some. Sixth density and up is interesting though, where it's non-physical, just advanced consciousness of light energy that only emote loving guidance, like how we often think of angels in a way. Fourth story. This story was shared by u/cr1song1111GHT. Currently working on the Navajo Reservation. Here are my very strange encounters. I have been staying in Gallup, New Mexico and working on Navajo Nation both on the NM and AZ side doing 3D mapping for fiber optic cable routes. Overall, it has been a great experience knowing that my work will help bring high-speed internet to tribe members far outside of any city centers on the reservation. My encounters with the Navajo people have been very positive. To complete these 3D maps, I drive around a vehicle with LiDAR GPS lasers, and a 5-angle 3D camera, so naturally people are a little suspicious when they see me driving around. Before I went on the reservation, my company, who is subcontracted by the cable provider, made sure to confirm that we had the express permission of the tribal authority to operate. I say this, because my route took me on roads that few white people would ever venture down, especially without tribal blessing. We're talking 6 miles on a 2-track with the nearest highway nowhere in sight. So, with that said, I think that in my driving on these routes that I either encountered the home of a skinwalker, or I hit some kind of spiritual trip wire that alerted certain Navajos to my presence on the spiritual plane. The man in the light blue truck. So in Gallup, on my off time, I decide to hike the surrounding areas. First I went to the Mentmore trailhead and hiked the small mesa. The hike was absolutely picturesque with a beautiful juniper and sage landscape. I pushed it hard, it was 95 degrees and I went 11 miles. It was worth every bit of the suffering. But the strange this, when I finally got back to my car at the trailhead, a man in a light blue truck pulled up right as I was walking up. Instantly, I caught a bad vibe. I did not undergo my usual post-hike stretch and water dump all over my head on a hot day. Instead, something told me to get in the car and drive, which I did. I thought that this was a strange encounter and that was the end of it. But it wasn't. 2 days later I went to the Hilso trailhead, 15 miles away in the pines. As I pull up to the trailhead, I see the same light blue truck, and the same man, just sitting there, staring out into the distance like he did before. Again, the hairs on the back of my neck went up. I went to the bathroom, and contemplated turning around, but I decided to continue on anyway. I hiked up, thinking the feeling would go away, it did not. It only got worse. Way worse. The entire hike I got the impression that someone or something was following me. It was palpable. A primal sense as if there was a mountain lion ahead of me on the trail. The feeling got so intense on the way back, that I carried my knife with me. I have never felt the need to carry my knife. When I got back the guy was gone. Thank God. But I could not help but come away with the impression that he was checking me out, somehow spiritually. Believe me, I know this isn't the hard evidence you all are looking for, but trust me when I tell you, the eerie vibe was otherworldly. Also, the odds of this guy being at both spots, once when I just ended, and once when I just began the hike, are a little too high for comfort. But there have been other instances. I have had crows follow me around the reservation roads in ways that don't seem to make sense. Once, when I was taking down my gear in Tehachapi, a crow literally seemed to say my name. I looked up and he was on a power pole. He just stared me down. Also, his caws did not sound like a crow's. It was very bizarre. So long story short, while I did not physically encounter a skinwalker, I think I encountered some kind of envoy of dark spiritual forces of the Navajo in that man in the blue truck, and the crows. What do you guys think? In any event, I trust my feelings. Fifth story. This story was shared by you/TommySticks87. Mimicking cryptid. My story is a little boring, but it just happened to me on Wednesday, so here you go. I was rock climbing with two other guys in Colorado and was belaying one of them when the two of us on the ground heard something weird. The commands we use to communicate that we are safe at the top of a route are, name of guy on the ground, off belay, which prompts the belayer to unclip the rope from his belay device so the climber can pull slack out of the rope. The response to that command is, name of guy at the top of the route, belay off. The climber was approximately 40 meters up on a 50-meter route. I didn't know this at the time. The rope stopped moving, which isn't uncommon when someone is having a hard time with a move, or is setting up an anchor, which is what I thought was going on. Then we heard it. A voice that sounded way closer to the ground, like close enough we could have had a shouting conversation, and way further left off route of where the climber should have been. It said, Tommy Sticks, off belay. I looked at the other guy in our climbing party who was just as confused as I was. He said to me, what the fuck was that, and we discussed where the climber should be at this time and that we shouldn't be able to hear him that well. The rope still wasn't moving, but I decided to keep him on belay. I figured it would be best to keep him safe and just feed slack through my belay device, in the event that it wasn't him. Turns out it wasn't. A few moments later the rope started moving again, later followed by a faint, syllable counted, Tommy Sticks, off belay, that sounded way more like what it should have. We didn't really think anything of it, but we had been traveling down the wall and hit a few routes without seeing anyone. We also had a friend just a few months ago that burned in on a route when someone took him off belay when he wasn't safe. I remember seeing a video of a hiker, or rancher or something, walking down the road when he hears a voice of a woman calling him off the road. The guy stops to try to figure out what's going on, then just gets out of there because of how weird it was. Is there a specific cryptid that mimics the voice of a person? Sixth story. This story was shared by you/Picapicap. My skinwalker encounter growing up. I was just talking to my boyfriend about some weird stuff I saw as a kid. He's a hardcore believer in skinwalkers and won't say it or even let me say it after it gets dark in fear of attracting one. My story starts with coming back from the store with my family. In my village, an entire new neighborhood was being built. Mind you, I live in an area that used to have a lot of forest around me, which has since been destroyed due to people building houses. There was a dirt/gravel road in the middle of the woods from the main road that led to a shortcut to my house. I was maybe 9 or 10 at the time, and I distinctly remember sitting in the middle seat in the middle row of our family minivan, so I got a clear view in between the driver's seat and passenger seat. I was talking with my younger siblings goofing off, and I looked up to see it crouched on the road. It looked almost exactly like the picture you get when you Google the rake. It had pale gray skin, it was freakishly slender, and it had eyes like reflectors. I freaked out and screamed out saying something along the lines of, "What is that?" and both of my parents turned around asked what I was talking about. I burst into tears and see it run over behind a tree. It's so tall. I see it peek from the tree a couple of times and explain what it looked like to my mom while hysterical. My mom didn't believe me at all and got mad at me for trying to scare my siblings. Around that time I used to watch a lot of those ghosts caught on tape type stuff on YouTube, and I'd show my younger siblings, which resulted in many nightmares for them. My dad on the other hand said it was probably just a deer. It looked nothing like a deer. I still remember those eyes. When we passed by the tree I saw it run behind, nothing was there. It was completely dark, I thought I must have imagined it, until my dad told me he saw something too when we got home. He told me he saw something out of the corner of his eye but didn't get a good look since I started screaming, and he turned around to look at me. To this day, it still scares me, and I never walk too close to the woods at night. 7th story. This story was shared by you/Verovan94. Creature on back road. If you read my first encounter, or whatever you want to call it, well, this all happened just about 7 kilometers down the road from that. A few years later I was out hunting with a friend when we lost legal light. So we hiked back to the truck and hit the road in his parents' new Ford half-ton, the ones with the sensors all over the vehicle. We had some music playing as we were just heading back towards town again, when the music started acting weird and cutting in and out with static, so me being in the passenger seat, disconnected the Bluetooth and reconnected the phone. Music cleared up and we continued down the road. We got up to the KM board on the road that my previous encounter took place, and I mentioned, "Oh hey, that's the whistle block that we logged a couple years back." Half jokingly, because I couldn't make heads or tails of it. My friend replied, "Griyayat, thanks for that," as I had told him the story before. We continued slowly driving down the road because it gets pretty rough in a couple spots and the road has a few sharp turns and an S-bend. Well, we go about a kilometer further and the music starts screeching and doing what we can only describe as alien noises. So I disconnect the Bluetooth again and my friend says, "Oh, Mom's got a cord in here." So he stops and gets the cord for me. I plug the phone in and play music again. Another kilometer down the road and the phone goes off. I mean, loud alien squealing and sounds similar to that dial-up internet noise from the 90s. We had started into the S-bend when this was happening, and we shut the music off completely as we are driving still, making the one half of the S-turn, and then we both look up from the music deck/screen and the headlight illuminate a figure standing in the middle of the road. So we swerve and take the ditch a bit, still going probably 30 kilometers per hour, and get the truck back up on the road. We continue coasting down the road as we are both in awe after just seeing a flash of this thing. I finally say, after what seemed like 5 quiet minutes, "Man, did you just see?" My friend cuts me off and says, "A skeleton in the middle of the road?" I say, "Yeah. Like a white rib cage, and a deer skull for a face." He finishes. I said, "Turn around, what the FCK was that? Does someone need our help?" Not thinking that we are in the middle of nowhere, with no vehicles around or any that we had passed from other hunters. It was early season and no one bow hunts here anyways. My friend said, "I'm not turning around, I feel sick. Like I'm going to throw up." And he continued driving. We didn't see another vehicle until we hit pavement again. It was taller than the pickup by easily a couple feet. I'm 6 feet 1 inch and my forehead is at the top of the window for reference. It has black surrounding the white of the bones with long arms half stretched to its sides as if it was saying, "Try and hit me." I watched this thing past the passenger window and stared up at it as we wailed by it, and it was definitely 3-dimensional, tall with long arms and dark. Dead looking. Like light was sucked into it without reflecting anything. Hard to explain. When we hit service again, my friend received a text message from his mother saying, "What did you two idiots hit in my brand new truck?" I guess the new Ford send near accident reports to the owner when the sensors pick up something. I'm an old school Chevy guy, so I don't know, haha. The only thing I can find online that resembles what we both saw is a Wendigo without the antlers. Or the headlights didn't illuminate them anyway. 8th story. This story was shared by you/Kiwasan Criminis. My Arizona encounter. I was driving with my friend to his home in southern Arizona. We had to drive through several reservations, mostly Navajo, to get there, and he warned me that if I saw anyone standing by the side of the road or in the road that I shouldn't look them in the eye or even pay attention. A couple hours into the drive, only me and my friend, who was driving, were awake. I saw a man dressed all in tan leather and wearing a large, wide-brimmed hat standing by the road. I didn't listen to what my friend said and looked at it directly. Every couple of miles, I saw this same man. Always on the road, always looking at me. I got glimpses of his face sometimes, he appeared to have none. Eventually I shut my eyes until we got to his town because I was afraid. I didn't see anything further while we stayed there. We go back to the west just about every year. The last time we went, we spent a night in a town in the mountains where his family had a cabin and we got stuck in the snow. We called a towing company and a single man came to help us out. We talked at length with him, or at least I did. I recall him being native, with long black hair and wearing a tan suit, including an animal skin on his shoulders. No hat like the person I saw on the road. He was very friendly and wanted to eat dinner with us. We said no because we didn't have enough food for him and us. He offered to go buy us food and bring it back. We said no to this also. Recently, my friends and I were talking about this day. They didn't see a native man. They claimed that we were helped by a man with short, blonde hair and a southern accent. That he was wearing snow gear and never asked to eat with us. My friend asked me if I had seen anything unusual somewhere else, and I told him about the man on the road. He told me that I saw a skinwalker and it was following me. I live on the East Coast, so he proposed that it only came looking for me when I was in the area. Since that encounter, I have almost constant dreams about going back to Arizona. What do you make about this encounter? Besides my one friend, no one else believes me. It creeps me out to this day. I went to Nevada a few weeks ago and had no incidents. We're supposed to go back to Arizona in the winter. I'm a little nervous. 9th story. This story was shared by you/Tolicker85. Skinwalker Encounter. This is a very short story, but I really need to get it out there. I was driving through a narrow road at around 2 in the morning. This was after I finished my late shift as I work at a hospital and a car crash happened and was in need of immediate surgery. Okay, now back to the road. This road was surrounded by trees and I was used to hearing crickets, but this time it was extremely quiet. My immediate thought was a skinwalker because I love spooky stories, but I told myself to stop being ridiculous as I was scaring myself. All of a sudden a terrible smell hit me and I closed all the windows to help with the smell what was before me. At this point all I could think of was skinwalker, but I tried to make sense of this and accept it was probably a dead deer or moose creating the odor. This next part happens very fast, so be ready. As I was going down the road, a hunched wolf was sitting right in front of my headlight. My heart skipped 5 beats, then I remembered all the stories I read. One of my favorites was from Entropic Society and knew this was not a wolf because it was huge. Its legs looked like they were smashed by boulders and reattached. Its head snapped to me on one side and its head was tilted to its right. The thing what made me know is when it stared into my soul as it stood up to be 8 foot tall, its yellow eyes and its human hands slowly crept towards me. I drove to right into that thing and knocked it down barely, with gave me enough time to go through that tiny gap the giant monster left. As I made it through the gap my wing mirrors collapsed in because of how narrow it was. Okay, this bit makes me tremble as I write it down. It started to run faster than my car. I tried to go full throttle, but from ramming into the skinwalker messed up my front part of the car that I was so close to the city I could see the street lights and a few drunkies beside trash. At the last moment it gripped onto the back of my car and its nails penetrated the roof of my ceiling. Now I was just leaving the forest when it jumped off and stared at me through the mirror inside of the car. I made it home and just did not speak to my brother or my sister and went to sleep. The next morning I told this to my brother, who guaranteed I saw a skinwalker. This happened 4 months ago and now I take a route which adds 20 minutes to my drive, but it's better than that cursed route. 10th story. This story was shared by u/lilj20188812. I think it lives in the fields. I live in the middle of dozens of fields laced with small wooded regions, all of which was once incredibly dense forest and swamp land. My road has no street lamps or light aside from 2 porch lights that barely light the fucking porches. This has been something I've been afraid of my whole life. I see a tall figure, bigger than a cornfield at full growth. A wide mouth and a long snout, and its eyes aren't red. No. Worse. Black. I have seen it outside of house on nights when I have left my curtains open. It's got these spinny things jutting from its skin and its skin is always bleeding. It's sometimes far away but other times not there at all. I kid you not. This thing is so much of a terror we have never kept dogs outside for long at night. Nor us. The only time we leave the house alone at night is if we are with someone or if it's not a long distance. But the long distance isn't short enough for me. I feel like every time I turn my back to the night it's running at me. I find myself sprinting from my car on late nights. At one point I was with a friend. He and I were talking about life and driving around the country roads where he lived. It's about 2 miles deep into the forested area and we got to talking about stories. Bad ones. He mentioned he never felt safe leaving his house at night, even to step 5 feet from the door. I told him the same. And that's when he described the tall figure with bony things sticking out of its back and almost no meat at all on its bones. When I asked him whether or not he had seen the eyes, he was silent. He and I do not hang out much anymore, but it sucks less knowing I'm not the only one. My grandmother swears to have seen things on these roads and in these fields. She and the adults used to gather in the living room and talk about happy things, and as it got darker, they got into darker stories. I'll admit I sat outside the living room and eavesdropped. It was terrifying to hear these, but my parents have seen the figure in the cotton fields in mid-October. Seen it move like a diseased dog. To quote my dad, it looked like a piece of dead skin with fucking broken branches as antlers. I have not seen the antlers yet. But I still think what we've seen is a Wendigo. Or maybe more than one Wendigo. 11th story. This story was shared by u/lilj20188812. I think it lives in the fields. I live in the middle of dozens of fields laced with small wooded regions, all of which was once incredibly dense forest and swamp land. My road has no street lamps or light aside from 2 porch lights that barely light the fucking porches. This has been something I've been afraid of my whole life. I see a tall figure, bigger than a cornfield at full growth. A wide mouth and a long snout, and its eyes are not red. No. Worse. Black. I have seen it outside of house on nights when I have left my curtains open. It's got these spinny things jutting from its skin and its skin is always bleeding. It's sometimes far away but other times not there at all. I kid you not. This thing is so much of a terror we have never kept dogs outside for long at night. Nor us. The only time we leave the house alone at night is if we are with someone or if it's not a long distance. But the long distance is not short enough for me. I feel like every time I turn my back to the night it's running at me. I find myself sprinting from my car on late nights. At one point I was with a friend. He and I were talking about life and driving around the country roads where he lived. It's about 2 miles deep into the forested area and we got to talking about stories. Bad ones. He mentioned he never felt safe leaving his house at night even to step 5 feet from the door. I told him the same. And that's when he described the tall figure with bony things sticking out of its back and almost no meat at all on its bones. When I asked him whether or not he had seen the eyes, he was silent. He and I do not hang out much anymore, but it sucks less knowing I'm not the only one. My grandmother swears to have seen things on these roads and in these fields. She and the adults used to gather in the living room and talk about happy things, and as it got darker, they got into darker stories. I'll admit I sat outside the living room and eavesdropped. It was terrifying to hear these, but my parents have seen the figure in the cotton fields in mid-October. Seen it move like a diseased dog. To quote my dad, it looked like a piece of dead skin with fucking broken branches as antlers. I have not seen the antlers yet. But I still think what we've seen is a Wendigo. Or maybe more than one Wendigo. 12th story. My friend and I went hiking and I'm starting to think she never left those woods. This story was shared by you/Jamfrons, so credits to him. My friend Samantha and I were so excited to take a road trip together to go hiking somewhere further from home. We'd been talking about it since we graduated college a few years back and finally found the time. Well, she always made the time. It was mainly me that had trouble balancing work with anything else. Looking back now, I wish I had spent more of this trip focusing on Sam, the scenery, and being present in the moment. I wish I had been a better friend. Sam was the most excited for our trip. The week before we left, she was texting me about restaurants in the area, stuff to do. She made a Spotify playlist with both of our favorites so we could listen to 7 hours worth of an eclectic mix of classic rock, pop, and black metal, and was marking trailheads we might enjoy on her Google Maps app. I felt bad for putting the trip off for so long. We got to catch up, explore, try cool food. We had a great trip up until our final hike. We're both in decent shape, and since we had the supplies and plenty of daylight, we decided we were going to try a longer, unpaved trail that went around this beautiful lake. It was the last hike of our trip and we decided to take a more difficult and less crowded trail. Initially, it was a wonderful hike. The water was such a surreal shade of blue, and the pine trees and rolling hills were breathtaking. The air was thinner than we were used to, but so refreshing. As we hiked around one bend, I almost ran right into Sam's back. I had been falling behind, focusing on placing my feet in exactly the right locations in the soft dirt so I didn't go sliding down 20 feet to the shore. Sam stood frozen, a deer in front of her blocking the trail. As I approached with my backpack jingling, and breathing heavily, the deer stood for a moment more, tilting its head sideways at me before darting back into the pines. She looked back at me, her face tight. "Did you see that? The deer?" "Yeah, it was pretty magical." She gave a little laugh as she started up again so we could both move on to the section of the trail that had sturdier footing. "No, I mean, something was wrong with that deer. It was way too comfortable around me, and I don't know if you could see or hear it, but it was drooling and making these weird sounds." We continued on in silence after that as we focused on our footing and the scenery, stopping every so often to take pictures. One time, when we were stopped, we heard rustling to our right, higher up on the hill. I got the bear spray out and held onto it. It seemed to be walking parallel to us, roughly matching our pace. It sounded big, too. Eventually the hiking trail rose to meet the higher part of the hill, and I couldn't help but sigh in relief. I'd been so worried I'd roll my ankle and tumble down the mountain, so it was good to have more room so I wasn't walking right on the edge. Back in college I'd sprained my ankle badly but couldn't afford to see a doctor. It healed a bit oddly, and since then my left ankle has been iffy. After a while, I needed to sit for a moment, walking uphill for an hour in addition to the 6,500-foot elevation. I was struggling. Maybe I'm also a bit more out of shape than I had been willing to admit, too. Sam sat with me for a moment but then saw some wildflowers about 10 feet into the woods and left to go take a quick picture. With her gone I felt a sudden chill. Something was watching me. "Sam," I called out nervously as the rustling grew louder and I gripped my container of bear spray tightly. It stepped out of the woods, and it was just a deer. Or, more specifically, it was the deer, the same one that Sam had encountered. Now that she had pointed it out, I could see what she was saying. The deer had no issues approaching me. It was scrawny, walked slowly, but like it had a bit too much to drink, and it was definitely drooling. I jumped up and waved my arms at it. "Go away." I knew it was sick and the poor thing was confused and probably suffering, but it creeped me the hell out. It cocked its head and seemed to be studying me, looking me up and down. It approached me and made some sort of gasping sound. It was opening and closing its mouth in a way which deeply unsettled me for some reason. "Sam!" She came running towards me from the woods, and when I turned back it had gone. "Are you okay? What happened?" The creepy deer was back. "I know it sounds silly, but think it's been following us." I told her how it had been behaving. "Do you think it's rabid?" "Poor baby," she said sympathetically, "possibly. Or, I wonder if it has CWD. Either way, we should probably let the park rangers know just in case." We had decided we'd stick together, but after a few miles, she ended up ahead of me again. She tends to inch forward to get pictures, whereas I tend to walk past sites, then have regrets and double back to take pictures. I had walked back a bit and was sitting down angling my phone weirdly to try and fit the scene in front of me in the frame when I heard Sam's voice, but I couldn't make out what she was saying. "Hey, I'll be right there," I said, my voice raised slightly, assuming she was talking to me. Then, she screamed. "Sam!" I stood up, and tried to walk as quickly and carefully as possible. Her screaming changed from fear to agony, and it sounded like she was sobbing. I wasn't sure what happened, but I could tell she was scared and likely hurt. I suddenly realized I was still holding our only canister of bear spray. Against my better judgment, I started running as fast as I could, and for a while I was making good time, but then my left foot landed a patch of soft dirt at the edge of the trail, my ankle rolled, and I was falling. I don't remember hitting the ground, but I remember opening my eyes, flat on my back, about 15 feet below where I had been standing. It was also dark outside. We'd started hiking at least 6 to 7 hours before sunset. I tried to stand, but it was a struggle. I was confused, disoriented, trying to get up was taking all my energy and focus. I had a deep feeling of dread I couldn't explain. As I started slowly moving upwards on my hands and knees, I tried to recall what had happened leading up to my fall. Sam sounded hurt. She was screaming. I had run after her and then I fell. "Shit, Sam." I called her name, my voice hoarse, but no response. My phone was surprisingly only minorly damaged, but I had no reception. Luckily, since it had been buckled to me, I still had our backpack. I dug through it. We had first aid kits, but I figured I could patch myself up later. I didn't want to stay down here any longer than I had to. I found my knife, and my headlamp. After about 20 minutes I had slowly, and painfully, ascended back towards where I had fallen from. My hands were raw and I could feel my right knee bleeding through my pants. I was trying to go slowly since I trusted my feet even less now, and dizziness was starting to creep in, but panic and fear drove me forward. Once I made it back to the trail, I had to sit for a moment. I heard rustling behind me and felt a sudden pang of fear. Something or someone had injured Sam, and here I was sitting alone, injured, with my back to the woods, in the dark. I tried calling her name, in case it was her that I heard. No response. I stood up and started limping as quickly as possible towards the direction that I had last heard her scream. Luckily the ground had evened out, because I could feel myself weaving unsteadily. I knew that something terrible may have happened to her, but kept trying to keep that thought out of my mind. As my calls to her remained unanswered and it became harder to imagine a scenario in which she was okay, I felt my throat tighten and tears roll down my cheeks. I kept looking for her. I knew she wouldn't just leave me here. I think part of me knew then, that she was gone. She would have been searching for me if she was okay, and even if she left to get help, I think they would have found me by then. Somehow, eventually I navigated my way to where I thought she had last been. I was hoping maybe if she was injured, she was okay and just out of it and confused like I was. My foot caught in the mud and I fell. Lights flashed behind my eyelids and I felt overcome with nausea. The light from my headlamp had greatly dimmed, as it was now coated in mud and grime. I heard movement behind me. As the smell hit me, I realized the mud was dirt mixed with blood. I could taste it, mixed with the gritty texture. Leaves covered with what was likely blood stuck to my face and I felt something soft and wet under my shoulder. The rustling behind me became discernible as footsteps. I felt around for my knife, my bear spray, but instead felt something hard, sticky. I was certain I had just found out what happened to Sam and had a good guess at what was about to happen next to me. I felt no urge to get up as the footsteps got closer. I knew I couldn't outrun it. I closed my eyes trying to focus on something, anything else, not knowing if I wanted to see what was coming for me. The footsteps stopped, and I could hear labored breathing coming from above me. I waited, and then as no blows came, I opened my eyes. It was Sam. She stood over me, breathing heavily from her mouth. She was covered in blood. Her shirt and pants were torn, but she was alive. I let out a relieved sob and then could no longer hold back the tears. "Oh my God," I whispered, as I slowly moved to sitting, and then standing. "I thought I had lost you." I pulled her close to me into a hug. She stood motionless, her arms at her side. She stuck to me where her shirt was still a bit wet. Dried blood covered the neck of her shirt, and her midsection. Her hands, and unsettlingly, her mouth, were also smeared with blood. I could still hear her breathing heavily close to my ear. "What happened?" I asked, as I released her. She stared at me, but didn't respond. I figured she was a bit traumatized. Frankly, I wasn't sure how she was up and standing at all after whatever had happened. She was a bit wobbly but otherwise seemed to be able to walk. As we walked towards the car she fell behind me, which made me nervous as I didn't want to let her out of my sight. She kept stopping, staring over her shoulder, while I tried to coax her forward. Eventually, after what felt like forever, we made it back. My ankle was killing me, but I had tried to move as fast as possible. Although the woods were eerily silent, I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. When we got to her car, I was debating if we should drive ourselves to the hospital, or call 911. I had this feeling of terror that I couldn't shake. I pictured us making it all the way here to the car and then something breaking the windows, attacking us. I decided we needed to leave now. "Do you have your keys? Do you think you can drive?" I asked. She had an old Jeep pickup and was very sensitive about other people driving her baby, plus I wasn't sure I could drive us with my ankle as it was. She said nothing, cocked her head at me. "I know, we look like we've been mauled by a bear." I caught myself and winced, feeling suddenly insensitive. She clearly had been attacked by something or someone. When she said nothing, displayed no emotion or reaction, I cautiously continued, "But I have a bad feeling. I think we need to leave, like right now. I'd rather call for help when we're back on the main road, or just drive straight to the hospital." She remained motionless, staring back into the woods, and I wondered if she lost her keys in whatever struggle she had. Luckily, I had her spare with me. I unlocked the doors and she continued to stand outside. I realized I would need to punish my ankle a bit more because she was far too out of it to drive. I slid in, but she remained motionless. "Sam, get in, please. Something is out here still. Please." She was licking her lips, staring back at me again. In the darkness, her blue eyes looked almost black. I limped back out of the seat and opened her door for her, and had to guide her in. I buckled her in after she made no move to do so for herself. As we drove and headlights of passing cars illuminated the interior, I kept checking on her out of the corner of my eye. She was breathing in and out of her mouth and staring at me. I noticed now, in the better light, that she was drooling. "Hey, how are you doing?" No response, but she began opening and closing her mouth and making a wet gasping sound as she breathed in and out. Her breath reeked and her teeth were tinged pink. I don't have much medical knowledge, but I was worried she had a punctured lung due to the strange sounds she was making. "Hold tight, we're about 20 minutes from the hospital." Despite my ankle, I drove as fast as I could. We made it in 10. As we pulled up, I helped guide her out of the car and walked behind her, steadying her. I noticed something: her shirt was on inside out. It hadn't been this morning. Likely because of how we looked, they found rooms for us immediately in the ER. I had a bad sprain and a concussion, and would need a few stitches, but it felt so good just to be out of those woods. I asked the nurse that came to check on me about how Sam was doing. I mentioned to him I'm not sure if she was attacked by an animal or a person. I mentioned what I had noticed about her shirt, and that we may have encountered a sick animal, in case any of that helped. When he returned, he was clearly distressed. Sam was gone. She hadn't appeared to be outwardly injured, strangely, but they had wanted to assess for internal trauma. However, the first moment they had left her alone, she had just walked out, judging by the bloody footprints. It's been weeks and I haven't seen Sam since. Her mom hasn't either. She has been working with the police out here. They think Sam has a head wound, and is just confused and will turn up in town eventually. But, a few days ago, I heard on the news that a partial skeleton was found on the trail we were on. Likely the victim of an animal attack, they said, and due to the condition of the body, they were asking for leads so they could use dental records to help identify the victim. This might sound crazy, but I think it's her they found. I don't know how to explain it, but I don't think Sam ever left those woods that night. It's my fault, and I don't know what that thing was that I drove into town. If you live in southern Colorado, please be safe. I'm sorry. 13th story. Haunted by the Wendigo. This is a story from my childhood. I'm in my 30s now. I grew up in the Northeast US. My family liked to spend time in the woods, and we had a cabin, and often stayed there in the summer. I had a very traumatic childhood. My grandpa died when I was 4, and I took it really hard. I completely stopped talking for about a month or so. I can't remember not talking, but I remember the nightmares. Night after night, I would have a terrible dream, where I was alone in the woods, and I would try to find my way out, and I would run into this awful demon that had a deer skull for a head, and something like a human skeleton for a body. Once I would see it, all I could feel was absolute loneliness, and I would wake up screaming. The nightmares continued for about a month or so, then they slowly faded away. My kindergarten teacher told my mom I probably could use professional help, but I started speaking again shortly after that, so my mom thought everything was fine. I never forgot those nightmares. When I was a teenager, I couldn't sleep one night and I started watching this movie on TV at like 2 a.m. It was called Wendigo. Once I saw the Wendigo, I nearly had a panic attack. It was almost exactly what I saw when I was young. This depiction had a deer head, not a deer skull, but this movie was only made relatively recent. I read up on the Wendigo, and at the time I saw it in my dreams, I did feel desperately isolated and alone. It made me afraid to go in the woods by myself for years. You could try to rationalize it and think that I must have seen or heard about the Wendigo before having nightmares about it when I was little, but I don't think that was the case. 14th story. By you/deadgirl1367. Wendigo or skinwalker, not sure. Immediate help please. First time using Reddit, please bear with me. Also, if there's typos, it's because my phone is 6 years old and the keypad is very uncalibrated now. My fiance's farm has had a problem with whatever it is for years. However, it really hadn't been an issue as much as a presence. Like having a cougar on your land. You know it's there and could attack at any second. But it just doesn't. Our home is old, BTW. Very old, and 2 of the beams in the basement are made up of giant logs that may have come from the woods behind the field. So anyways, the first time its presence was seen, I was on the phone with my guy and he was sitting in his mom's car at night. We were teenagers then. That's when he noticed in this, admittedly really odd-looking, twisted tree that's outside a creature that was large and, in his words, looked like a man becoming a beast. He carefully, calmly, got out of the car and hurried inside. It didn't seem to notice him. There's still claw marks on the tree. Not bear-like or cat-like. I looked up the area, and back then, Google's so messed up now, I can no longer find it, that a Wendigo king has the hunting ground of the entire length of the creek that is down the road. It was this time of year, and he said when he saw it, he heard laughter and war drums. Then I moved here years later. One night I saw what I thought was a red reflector by our mailbox. I was confused about who put that there. It hadn't been that morning. As I turned my headlights towards the box to better see, the red circle suddenly pulled back into the massive field across the street. As our friend and I got out of the car, he said he saw something that wasn't an animal standing in the field. We hurried inside. This was autumn. The next autumn I was driving home alone and saw that same red reflector bobbing across the street. When I approached, it suddenly whipped around like a startled animal and the light zoomed back into the field. I refused to leave the truck without someone coming for me. I should add I've seen that same light pacing the upstairs of the barn, through the window. Next time was during the 4th of July and we were having a small party. And had the barn door open. When dusk began I saw it. Giant, maybe as big as a horse. It looked like a man with no hair. Grayish purple, I suppose frostbitten colored, skin. Naked. Incredibly skinny as though it has no organs. A big grin on its face which seemed to be either because its lips were forcibly pulled back over its mouth or perhaps it had no lips or cheeks. Big hands and feet, and no antlers. Walking into the barn like a wolf. Reminded me of something out of Bloodborne. Its eyes were black at the moment. I told my guy and he didn't believe me as I was begging him to help me close the barn. There's openings in the back it could leave from, but the door being open didn't feel right after that. Then his great-aunt asked, "Did anyone see that little girl go into the barn?" It's well known by our family that a ghost of a small girl in white roams the farm and is well liked by us. He immediately agreed after that. Then nothing more. Occasionally I feel something reach out for me as I walk around at night, but I've read about W's when I was young and there's many spiritual things about me that seem to keep me safe. Regardless, I carry a buck knife when I travel at night just in case I have to defend myself. But then his mom left. His mom is very unhealthy and gluttonous in every form. Over 2 years without her and our farm was peaceful. We had been caring for his grandfather, who always said something dark followed him around. And in the last week of his life weird things kept happening. Then he died suddenly and nobody knows why. I had stated earlier that month that the more his mom was showing up again and the more we cleaned up and worked on the farm, the angrier something seemed to get. In fact, a few weeks before something grabbed onto my guy's father in the barn and make horrible screeches when he put up the mower after dark. There was also one night the barn got left open by him and as we were headed inside we heard the neighbors screaming. But my guy assured me that he hears them do that every few months. However, while the men sound like they're getting murdered, the woman always sounds fake. But I always hated their house because turkey vultures obsessively circle their plot, like a lot, sometimes 20. So then 2 nights ago, my guy had to help his mom, who's now situated herself into his grandma's home like the parasite she is, for almost 2 weeks. Things had been feeling peaceful and earlier that day I had been hoping that Grandpa captured the creature inside his body and it was going to be killed when he got cremated. Well, then they heard the lady neighbor screaming. Repeatedly. Inhumanly. From our pond. Before that they thought they heard a sound like a cat growl as well. Well, now his dumb mother is going around personifying it as she and saying she's a witch but that she's nice and spoke to her and she don't mean no harm. I've been a practicing white witch my whole life. That is an evil spirit. She's a fool. Furthermore, as she was blabbing that to my boyfriend's sister who was driving home at night, a deer suddenly exploded out of nowhere and destroyed her car. This sister was wanting to inherit the land around the pond. Mid-May we had also had a deer jump in front of us so fast it seemed impossible. Biggest deer I had ever seen and impossibly beautiful looking. Thankfully many people stayed with us while the cops got there. But ever since she had been visiting the last month, worse and worse things have been happening. Which brings me to today. To me, myself. My guy was gone early today to help his uncle out. I was sleeping alone for the first time in months. I had a nightmare. It was that you sent me home from the food pantry because you had more stuff to do, but it was night. So I parked near next door cause the food was for them and got out, and suddenly your mom came out from behind the house and was talking to me and I was just trying to get done quickly. But then I realized the whole time she was over I couldn't quite make out her face. So I started turning my flashlight onto her and your mom was like, "Oh, honey, now you don't want to do that." And when I did, it was like seeing a refracted shadow. Like behind this vague silhouette was the appearance of your mom's hair and hands and feet, but the shadow was in front with this incomplete appearance of her in the back. And when I realized what it was, my heart stopped and I started slowly backing up to their porch as this terrifyingly powerful man's voice said, "You don't want to do that." Before my head erupted with terrifying music and that voice laughing maniacally, enough to drive someone insane. But I kept continually calmly going to the porch as I began to forcibly pray and say, "In the name of God and Jesus, leave me alone, and Christ compels you," and all that stuff. This is what I had texted him. It was horrifying. And I could sense it didn't want to devour me. It wanted to keep me. I said I was a practicing witch, but I also have been confirmed as a Catholic, and I have a belief that's parts of every old religion and some of my own beliefs that I've formed from things I've been witness to. I awoke feeling like something was at my back. But my oldest cats were laying on me. Defensively. They're all still laying in bed with me and hadn't really in a long time. As I tried to get back to sleep, I prayed for my home and family to be kept safe. For positive energy to cover the land. And for evil spirits to be cast off of our land. Over and over and over until I finally fell back to sleep and had no more dreams. I have the most knowledge of mythical beings. I sing many songs while I work outside, including Cherokee songs. I work the land the old-fashioned way. I respect the land. Animals love me. And I've always felt that my soul is very, very old. Like it's been recycled for many lives. People always have called me a godsend as well, because I'm at the right place at the right time to help. I don't quite know what it wanted of me, but it didn't work because I'd previously been visited in my dreams many times by a demon who insisted my soul belonged to him, only for me to deny him each time. This being when I was only a teenager. What I need is help to keep it off our land. At this rate, my guy's mom is going to be killed by it. Or bring it closer to us all with her horrific miasma of an aura. I was already planning on planting sage and smudging the house as well. I've previously done so before. But if there's anything else we can do, I'd appreciate it. Any help at all. And I also know its hunting ground is indeed as vast as the creek is, because a coworker who lives at the other end, we're near one ending point, caught it on video when he was walking at night and showed me. Its eyes looked like the red reflector I kept seeing. It seems to like to rest in our barn. But it's always been that we leave it be and it leaves us be. Please help. I downloaded the app so I can easily check back. Only serious answers, please. I know there are skeptics to many things. I respect everyone's opinions and personal beliefs. But this is very serious. Also, I should add that as far as I know, there are no reservations around here at all. But that his great-grandfather was part Native Americans. Don't know what tribe. Thank you for any assistance. This has been over the course of roughly 10 years, by the way. 15th story. Possible skinwalker encounter. 2 weeks ago, me and a group of buddies were having a bonfire out in Kuna, Idaho. I was feeling down that night, so I decided to unload my dirt bike and take a little night ride on some trails. I went alone and rode for probably 3 miles from the fire up on a hill. I sat up there for probably 45 minutes and I was 100% alone up there. There was nobody around. From time to time I would hear small laughter really close by. Sounded like 2 to 3 people. It wasn't constant. I would hear it every 5 minutes and it kept getting closer. I had that funny feeling that I wasn't alone after all. So I went to go start my bike and of course it didn't want to start. I was able to start it going down the hill and it did not want to stay running. I don't think it sat long enough for the engine temp to drop all the way back down. I had to keep revving it to keep it running, trying to head back to the fire. The whole time I was really scared for no reason. I couldn't convince myself to go faster than 5 miles per hour, which was strange because I always haul ass. I have a light bar mounted on my bike, so I was able to see just fine. At first, riding back, I thought I seen shadow figures in the corner of my eyes, but they would disappear. I made it back safe and nothing else happened, but I knew there was something out there that night. I didn't think much of it until I heard my buddies talking about skinwalker stories in that same area. People tell me I got extremely lucky that night. I don't know what to believe. Who knows what was out there with me that night? The laughter, my bike not wanting to run, the feeling I had, and the shadow figures are all things in common I saw from other stories. It was a strange night. If anyone on here is from Kuna, Idaho and knows anything about skinwalker encounters out there, feel free to reach out. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.